January 1943. Somewhere in the frozen heart of the North Atlantic, a convoy battles the night. The sea is black and angry, rising in heavy swells that slam against the hulls of merchant ships pushing eastward toward Britain. Their decks glisten with ice. Their crews work in silence, breath turning to mist in the bitter wind. Every man knows the danger beneath them. A single sonar ping echoes through the darkness. Then another. The escorts tighten their formation. Moments later, a dull flash ripples across the horizon. One of the freighters has vanished behind a column of fire. The blast reaches the convoy seconds later, shaking the men awake with a sickening truth. A U-boat has struck again. Engines roar to full power. Depth charges are armed. Radio operators strain to catch any signal through the storm. For a few long minutes, the Allied ships stand alone, blind, vulnerable, and out of air cover. This is the mid-Atlantic gap, the black pit, where no land-based aircraft can reach them. But tonight, faint through the gale, a new sound emerges. A distant, steady hum rolling low over the waves. American aircraft, flying from an escort carrier hundreds of miles from land, are arriving at last. Their arrival will begin the change that Germany never expected. When the Second World War began, Britain stood at the edge of a long, unforgiving ocean. Its empire stretched across continents, but survival depended on a single lifeline: the Atlantic supply routes bringing food, fuel, raw materials, and weapons for North America. Every gallon of gasoline, every ton of wheat, every crate of ammunition had to cross the same cold, violent stretch of water. If those routes broke, Britain would collapse, not in months, but in weeks. Germany understood this with ruthless clarity. By late 1940, after the fall of France, the Kriegsmarine gained access to the long Atlantic coastline. Submarine pens in Brest, Lorient, La Rochelle, and Saint-Nazaire allowed U-boats to slip into the ocean faster, travel farther, and strike deeper than ever before. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat arm, believed he possessed the weapon that could strangle Britain without ever facing the Royal Navy head-on. His strategy was simple but mathematically devastating. Sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them. To Germany, the tonnage war was not just a naval strategy. It was the key to breaking British resistance. And for a time, it worked. In 1941 alone, U-boats prowled the Atlantic almost unchecked. They moved silently beneath the waves, shadowing convoys, waiting for darkness, then rising to launch coordinated attacks. The tactic became infamous: the wolf pack. One submarine would locate a convoy, radio the others, and soon a dozen U-boats would swarm the civilian ships from multiple angles. Torpedoes struck in rapid succession. Ships burned through the night, while escorts struggled to protect the scattered survivors. The numbers were terrifying. Every month, hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo were lost. Merchant ships vanished in flames, leaving oil slicks and drifting wreckage behind. Britain's food supply began tightening. Wheat and meat imports fell sharply. Fuel reserves shrank. The Admiralty warned Winston Churchill that if losses continued, Britain might not make it through the coming year. Churchill later wrote that the only thing that truly frightened him in the war was the U-boat peril. Convoys were a necessary defense, but they were not yet enough. Early in the war, Britain lacked both the escort ships and the long-range aircraft needed to protect the entire route. Air cover ended a few hundred miles from shore, creating a vast mid-ocean void where merchant ships sailed unprotected for days. U-boat commanders considered this area a hunting paradise, untouched, unobserved, and unreachable by Allied aircraft. The attacks here were relentless. The crews called it the Black Pit. Despite the growing danger, the Atlantic lifeline had to remain open. Without supplies, Britain could not feed its civilians, fuel its factory engines, or supply its armies in North Africa. Every convoy that slipped through kept the nation alive. Every convoy lost tightened the noose. By early 1942, the situation grew worse. After the United States entered the war, the U-boats surged westward. They prowled the American coastline in broad daylight, sinking tankers against the glow of city lights. The early months of 1942, what German submariners called the Second Happy Time, were catastrophic. Few escorts were available, and American coastal defenses were unprepared. The result was a massacre at sea. Germany believed victory was near. Donitz confidently estimated that if he could sink 700,000 tons of shipping per month, Britain would face economic defeat. His U-boat fleet was growing. New models were entering service. Submarine crews, hardened by years of combat, felt unstoppable. Yet beneath this apparent success lay a calculation Germany had failed to anticipate: American industrial power. Across the Atlantic, factories were gearing up to produce not just merchant ships and destroyer escorts, but a new class of vessel designed specifically to fight the U-boats in their most secure hunting grounds. A vessel that could bring aircraft deep into the mid-ocean gap, where no aircraft had ever flown before. And as losses mounted and pressure intensified, the Allies began searching for a way to turn the tide in a battle that was becoming the defining struggle for Britain's survival. The stage was set for a transformation Germany never expected. By mid-1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a critical threshold. The Allies understood the stakes fully now. If they failed to secure the ocean, no amount of courage on the ground or in the air could win the war. Factories, soldiers, fuel, aluminum, rubber, food, medical supplies, all depended on thousands of miles of open sea. And yet that same sea, particularly its center, remained deadly. The problem was simple in geography, but devastating in practice. Land-based aircraft had limited range. Even the best British Coastal Command squadrons and the long-legged American B-24 Liberators could not cover the entire expanse. Their reach ended hundreds of miles short of the convoy routes, leaving a rectangle of ocean roughly the size of Western Europe completely uncovered. Here, the U-boats operated with total freedom. They surfaced in daylight to recharge, maneuvered openly, and coordinated attacks without fear of aircraft dropping out of the clouds. This was the Mid-Atlantic Gap, the place sailors called the Black Pit. Convoys felt it immediately. As soon as the last shoreline patrol aircraft turned back, U-boat attacks intensified. Escorts braced for the familiar pattern: a sudden loss of radio contact as a submarine jammed communications, a periscope sighting that vanished instantly, then a torpedo strike beneath the bow of a tanker, followed by a second or third hit moments later. Flames lit the sky. Men jumped into freezing water. Hours later, another ship would vanish. The psychological weight was immense. Merchant crews dreaded the gap more than any storm. Even destroyer captains felt a unique helplessness. Their ships were fast and aggressive, but no matter how sharp their gunnery or how skilled their sonar operators, they could not shield the convoy from submarines they could not find. Meanwhile, the U-boat fleet expanded. German yards delivered new boats each month. Bases on the French Atlantic coast buzzed with activity as crews prepared for extended patrols. These new forward bases shaved hundreds of miles off the transit time to the hunting grounds, giving Germany a numerical and tactical advantage that Britain alone could not match. The Allies needed more escorts, more aircraft, and radically improved coordination. But above all, they needed a way to bring air power, the decisive weapon of the age, into the center of the ocean. The United States, with its enormous manufacturing base, began planning an answer. American shipyards had already stunned the world by launching Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. But speed alone was not enough. Cargo had to reach Britain intact, not merely be replaced. This required a new breed of naval support vessels. Ships that were small, cheap, fast to produce, and capable of carrying a handful of aircraft far into the Atlantic. The concept was radical: a miniature aircraft carrier. The official name was Escort carrier, but sailors called them Jeep carriers, baby flat tops, and sometimes Kaiser coffins, after the shipbuilder Henry Kaiser, whose yards produced them at unprecedented speed. They were far smaller than fleet carriers, about half the length, a third the aircraft capacity, and protected only lightly. But they did not need to fight Japanese carriers or stand in battleship gun lines. Their purpose was singular: bring aircraft to convoys, and hunt U-boats in the places submarines felt most secure. These escort carriers, designated CVs, could operate thousands of miles from shore, launching patrol aircraft that could scour the ocean for periscopes, shadows, wake trails, or surfacing submarines. They carried Wildcats, Avengers, and specialist crews trained for anti-submarine warfare. And crucially, they could be built in months, not years. The first American escort carriers began joining the Atlantic Fleet in late 1942. Their arrival marked a new strategic possibility, closing the mid-Atlantic gap entirely. Instead of convoys sailing blind for days, they could now travel under the watch of aircraft whose presence reversed the balance of terror. The U-boats would no longer be safe in the Black Pit. Still, Germany did not yet grasp the scale of the shift. Dönitz believed his submarines could adapt. He expected Allied losses to rise again and remained confident in the U-boat's superiority. But across Allied naval headquarters in London, Washington, and Halifax, officers sensed a turning point approaching. They now had radar-equipped aircraft, expanding escort fleets, and a new American-built weapon capable of striking submarines where they had never been threatened before. The question was no longer whether the Allies could respond. It was how soon their response would force the U-boats onto the defensive for the first time. And that moment was closer than Germany imagined. For the men who sailed the Atlantic, the Battle of the Atlantic was not an abstract campaign fought on maps. It was a grinding, personal struggle that lasted weeks at a time, fought in cramped steel rooms, on icy decks, and in the silent hours before dawn when fear felt heaviest. Aboard Allied merchant ships, life was punishing. Crews slept in bunks that vibrated constantly with engine noise. They ate meals that tasted of oil and salt. The smell of diesel clung to their clothes. But the true hardship was the waiting. The knowledge that at any moment a torpedo could tear the ship apart. There was rarely warning. One second a man stood on deck scanning the horizon. The next, he was thrown into frigid water amid burning oil and shattered steel. Destroyer escorts faced different pressures. Their crews were younger, trained for combat, and proud to protect the convoys. Yet even they felt the nerves tighten as the convoy approached the Black Pit. Without aircraft overhead, their world shrank to a few hundred yards of ocean illuminated by searchlights and star shells. Every sonar ping, every faint echo, every unexplained ripple could be a submarine closing in. Life aboard a German U-boat was no less demanding, and often far more brutal. The cramped interior smelled of fuel, sweat, mildew, and battery acid. Crews slept on torpedo racks and shared a single toilet. Fresh air disappeared within hours of diving. Food spoiled quickly, mold overtook bread, and sausages turned gray. But U-boat sailors, hardened by discipline and pride, believed they were elite warriors waging a decisive campaign. For many months, that belief seemed justified. They struck convoys with confidence, surfacing at night to fire torpedoes and disappearing before escorts could retaliate. The sense of mastery over the ocean gave them morale few other German units enjoyed. Yet by late 1942, the strain of constant danger deepened on both sides. Convoy crews watched the horizon in desperation. U-boat crews felt the weight of longer patrols, harsher seas, and a growing sense that the Allies were adapting. Rumors spread through submarine pens of new Allied weapons, new aircraft, and new tactics. The ocean seemed to be changing, slowly, then more rapidly. It was this human tension, fatigue, fear, endurance, that defined the battle as much as sonar, torpedoes, or strategy. And at the center of these experiences lay a simple truth. Every man on either side knew the next hours could rewrite the fate of the entire war. Angle 2. Tactical. The chessboard beneath the waves, the tactical duel between U-boats and convoy escorts became one of the most complex in naval history. Each side innovated, revised, and adapted constantly. German tactics revolved around the Wolfpack system. When a U-boat sighted a convoy, it shadowed it silently, reporting course and speed to headquarters. Other submarines converged, forming a loose perimeter. At night, they surfaced, moving quickly between the ships, firing torpedoes at close range from multiple directions. By staying on the surface, they could maneuver faster than submerged escorts and slip away before depth charges found them. Convoy escorts countered with convoy screens, destroyers and corvettes forming a defensive ring designed to intercept attacking submarines. Their tools were sonar, searchlights, star shells, and depth charges. Skilled commanders learned to anticipate submarine tactics, the expected angles of attack, typical approaches, and favored escape patterns. Escorts darted across the columns, attacking suspected contacts and driving submarines deep, forcing them to lose position. But the U-boats had an unmatched advantage in the mid-Atlantic gap. Here, escorts had no air support, and wolf packs could coordinate freely without fear of sudden aerial attack. Submarines could track a convoy for days, wear down the escorts, and strike again and again until they found a weak point. The absence of aircraft meant escorts could not extend their detection radius beyond sonar range. If a submarine stayed more than a few miles away, it was invisible, and since sonar worked poorly at high speeds or in rough seas, the U-boats used weather as a shield. Still, the tactical equation was changing. The Allies introduced HF/DF, Huff Duff, to locate U-boat radio signals. Improved radar began detecting surfaced submarines at night, and more skilled escort commanders replaced older ones lost earlier in the war. Yet all these tools had limits, and in the Black Pit, those limits were catastrophic. The tactical stalemate needed something the Allies did not yet possess: a weapon capable of stretching the reach of detection and firepower across the entire ocean. That weapon was about to arrive. Angle 3. Technological. Machines that rewrote the battle technology shaped the Battle of the Atlantic as profoundly as courage or strategy. Every major advance tilted the balance, sometimes subtly, sometimes abruptly. German submarines initially held major advantages. The Type 7 and Type 9 U-boats were reliable, efficient, and deadly. Their torpedoes, once early flaws were corrected, could break a ship with a single hit. Their radio networks allowed wolf packs to gather quickly. Their snorkels enabled limited underwater running later in the war. But Allied innovation expanded at a pace Germany could not match. Radar was one turning point. Early sets helped escorts detect U-boats on the surface, but range and reliability remained inconsistent. As the technology matured, aircraft gained radar capable of spotting submarines hundreds of miles from shore. But again, aircraft could not reach the mid-Atlantic. Then came HF/DF, allowing Allied ships to detect a U-boat's radio transmission angle. By triangulating signals, escorts could predict wolf pack convergence. Convoys shifted routes, forcing U-boats to reposition constantly. Sonar also improved. Models became more accurate, resistant to sea clutter, and better at tracking submerged submarines. Escorts learned to use depth charges and patterns, creating walls of pressure beneath the water. Yet none of these innovations solved the central problem. They could not be used where no aircraft could fly. They could not reach the Black Pit. They could not break the U-boat's sanctuary. Then came the U.S. Escort carrier, a technological leap that combined aviation, naval engineering, and mass production into one weapon. These small carriers brought radar-equipped aircraft directly into the mid-ocean. Avengers could spot periscopes from altitude. Wildcats could chase submarines on the surface. Both could relay sightings to destroyer escorts that launched coordinated attacks. This single innovation reshaped the technological landscape entirely. And soon, Germany would realize that these baby carriers were far more dangerous than their size suggested. Leadership shaped the tempo of the Battle of the Atlantic as sharply as any torpedo or radar set. At the center of Germany's campaign stood Admiral Karl Donitz, disciplined, analytical, and convinced that the U-boat was Germany's decisive weapon. He had spent years refining the wolf pack doctrine, drilling his commanders in tactics he believed could strangle Britain's maritime arteries. Even when other branches of the German military looked elsewhere, Dönitz remained fixed on the Atlantic, arguing that a sustained submarine offensive would force Britain to negotiate. He was not wrong about the U-boat's potential. In 1940 and 1941, his strategy seemed nearly flawless. British convoys were thinly protected, aircraft had short ranges, and U-boats were few in number, yet devastating in impact. Dönitz monitored losses closely, convinced that with 300 operational submarines, he could win the war at sea. His reports to Hitler reflected this confidence, reinforcing a German belief that the tonnage war was tilted in their favor. Across the ocean, Allied leadership evolved under intense pressure. In London, the Admiralty wrestled with escort shortages, radar limitations, and the sheer scale of the ocean they needed to protect. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King, an aggressive strategist known for his bluntness, pushed for a rapid expansion of escort fleets and long-range aircraft to protect American shores and close the Atlantic gaps. In Halifax, Canadian commanders coordinated convoy movements under increasing strain, managing routes, schedules, and limited escort assets. Yet the most significant shift in leadership came in early 1943 with the formation of the Allied Atlantic Command structures, which improved cooperation and centralized intelligence. For the first time, British, American, and Canadian commanders shared operational data in real time. Decrypts from German communications, convoy sightings, weather forecasts, and U-boat movement reports. This unity of command gave the Allies something Germany lacked: a fully integrated picture of the Atlantic battle space. Dönitz, relying heavily on U-boat reports and intermittent intelligence, began to lose strategic clarity. His submarines reported growing dangers, more aircraft sightings, and new Allied tactics that had no clear explanation. German losses mounted, but his belief in the U-boats' superiority persisted. Meanwhile, Allied leaders placed increasing faith in a new class of ship entering service: the American escort carriers. They saw these vessels not as makeshift carriers, but as strategic tools capable of shifting the entire balance of power. And soon, these commanders would deploy them into the heart of the Black Pit. Angle 5. Industrial. The arsenal that changed the ocean. If leadership guided the strategy, industry provided the muscle behind the transformation of the Atlantic War. In 1942, American shipyards were operating on a scale the world had never seen. Liberty ships slid off the ways at astonishing speed. One famous hull was assembled in just over 4 days. Steel mills roared day and night. Aircraft factories produced B-24s, Wildcats, and Avengers in numbers that dwarfed anything Germany could match. Destroyer escorts and corvettes rolled out of shipyards along the East Coast and Gulf Coast in an unending stream. But one innovation stood apart from the rest: the escort carrier. These ships were not elegant or heavily armored. They lacked the speed of fleet carriers and the endurance of battleships. But they were cheap, modular, and built-in. Massive quantities. Civilian hull designs were converted to carry aircraft. Merchant ship production lines were modified to accommodate them. In some yards, sections of escort carriers were manufactured inland and transported by rail to coastal assembly points. Their rapid construction created a new strategic advantage. The Allies no longer needed to stretch their limited number of long-range aircraft across impossible distances. Instead, they could bring the runway to the convoy. This was the decisive industrial edge Germany could never offset. U-boat production, though steady, could not keep pace with the scale of American output. Every time a submarine was sunk, German yards needed months to replace it. Meanwhile, U.S. factories could replace a lost escort ship in weeks and an escort carrier in just a few months. Industrial power did not merely sustain the Atlantic battle, it accelerated it. The sheer volume of American production flooded the oceans with new machines, new tools, and new crews. Germany, operating under bombing pressure and strict material limits, found itself outbuilt, outproduced, and increasingly outfought. And as more escort carriers reached the fleet, the balance in the Atlantic shifted further and further from German hands. Angle 6. Enemy POV. German shock in the safe zone for months. German U-boat commanders believed the Mid-Atlantic Gap was a sanctuary. The Black Pit was where submarines moved freely, surfaced openly, and attacked with confidence. Letters home described it as the only part of the ocean where the Allies could not touch them. Patrol logs reflected a tone of certainty. No aircraft here. No patrols. Clear seas. That certainty vanished in 1943. The first sightings were dismissed as mistakes. A pilot who had flown somehow beyond range, or a reconnaissance aircraft that had appeared unexpectedly before vanishing again. But then came reports of coordinated attacks. Aircraft arriving out of nowhere, diving with precision, forcing U-boats under before they could strike. Some submarines never resurfaced. Soon, radio messages filled with alarm. Aircraft attack, impossible range. Enemy planes over gap. New carriers operating in mid-Atlantic. Donitz refused to believe the early reports. He insisted the sightings were isolated. But U-boats continued disappearing. Survivors described the same thing. Aircraft appearing suddenly, strafing their decks, guiding destroyers toward their position. The sanctuary of the Black Pit was gone. German crews were stunned. Their invulnerable hunting ground had been breached, not by luck, but by a new American weapon. Escort carriers had arrived. And now, the decisive battle was about to begin. By the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its breaking point. For 3 bitter years, the ocean had been a graveyard, swallowing ships, submarines, and men in a struggle that seemed endless. But now, at the height of Germany's confidence and the Allies' desperation, a change was beginning. And it started with steel decks only 500 feet long, rising and falling on the mid-Atlantic swells. Escort carriers, the small, rugged, baby flat tops, had finally arrived where no aircraft had ever flown before. Convoy on 178. The first hammer blow on a cold morning in March, Convoy on 178 pushed through heavy seas west of Ireland. 4 days its escorts had reported sonar contacts. Faint, distant, circling. A wolf pack was hunting them. The convoy commander expected a night attack, the usual pattern in the Black Pit. But that morning, the sky changed. From the east, cutting low between the waves, came a line of American aircraft, FM, 2 Wildcats, and TBF Avengers. They rose off the deck of the USS Bogue, the escort carrier steaming 40 miles behind the convoy. Their engines cut through the wind like a warning the Atlantic had never heard before. Within minutes, a U-boat surfaced 5 miles off the starboard flank, assuming, as always, that no aircraft could possibly be overhead. The Avenger pilot could hardly believe his eyes. He rolled in, dropped depth charges in a perfect pattern, and watched the submarine erupt in a blast of steam and torn metal. The Black Pit had just been violated. The U-boat response, that single sinking, sent shockwaves through the wolf packs. But Donitz still believed the aircraft must have been lucky or lost. He ordered more boats into the convoy lanes, convinced he could overwhelm the new threat with concentrated power. It was a fatal miscalculation. Escort carriers were not lone ships. They traveled with destroyers, corvettes, subchasers, and support groups designed to hunt aggressively, not just defend. And above them circled aircraft in constant rotation, day and night, using radar to sweep the ocean, and Ark's U-boat captains could not escape. For the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. The night the wolf packs collided with a new reality 2 weeks later, a larger convoy, HX 231, came under attack from a massive wolf pack, nearly 20 U-boats converging from all directions. The Germans expected to break the convoy open before dawn. Instead, they found themselves ambushed from the sky. At 0300 hours, an Avenger flying night radar patrol picked up multiple contacts on the surface. The pilot assumed there were 2 submarines, then 3, then 5. Every sweep of his set revealed more. He radioed a single, chilling report. "They're all here. We've got the whole pack." Within minutes, Wildcats dove in with flares, lighting the ocean like a battlefield. Destroyer escorts surged forward, guns firing, depth charges rolling off their rails in thunderous cascades. U-boats that tried to flee on the surface were strafed into submission. Those that dove were trapped by coordinated sonar attacks. Germany had walked into a trap it did not know existed. When dawn finally broke, the ocean looked changed. Oil slicks stretched across the water like dark wounds. Men clung to rafts, shocked and silent. The wolf pack, the weapon that once terrorized the Atlantic, had been shattered by an enemy it had never believed could reach it. Donitz received the casualty reports that evening. He sat in silence for a long time, then spoke quietly to his staff. The enemy now has control of the air. The situation is critical. The U.S. Escort and the Hammer of May 1943 in May, the month U-boat veterans would later call Schwarzermai, Black May. The escort carrier U.S. Escort struck blow after blow in the Central Atlantic. Her aircraft found submarines refueling, traveling in groups, even attempting to hide among debris fields. Nothing worked. One Avenger, flying low in worsening weather, spotted a submarine barely 2 feet below the surface, its outline visible only because a wave rolled back at the perfect moment. The pilot released depth charges at point-blank range. The U-boat broke in half. Another group of aircraft caught a refueling milch cow in the middle of transfer. The tanker submarine exploded, leaving the dependent U-boats stranded without fuel and doomed. By late May, the numbers told the story. 41 U-boats lost in a single month. Germany's worst naval defeat in its history. Wolf packs withdrawn from the North Atlantic. The ocean that had once been a German hunting ground had turned on them completely. The emotional turning point across the Allied convoys. The mood changed almost overnight. Sailors who had spent months fearing the night now watched the sky with relief, hearing the drone of friendly aircraft echo across the waves. Captains who once maneuvered in helpless darkness now coordinated with powerful air patrols. Convoys that used a scatter now held formation with confidence. The escorts were no longer defending alone. The aircraft were no longer turning back at the horizon. The Black Pit, the graveyard of thousands, was no longer black. It was a battlefield the Allies finally owned. And for the first time in the war, the path to victory in the Atlantic was unmistakably clear. By May 1943, the wolf packs that had terrorized the Atlantic for years were unraveling. The months of relentless U-boat attacks, once unstoppable, had reached a turning point that Germany had never anticipated. The combination of escort carriers, improved radar, coordinated hunter-killer groups, and superior Allied intelligence made the open ocean a lethal gauntlet. The Battle of Convoy ONS 5, departing Liverpool in late April 1943, became the theater of this dramatic shift. Nearly 40 merchant vessels, escorted by a mix of British and American destroyers and corvettes, faced a wolf pack of over 30 U-boats. The Germans approached with confidence, expecting easy kills. For days, they stalked the convoy under cover of darkness, sending regular reports back to Donitz. But the Allies were ready. Aircraft from escort carriers USS Bogue and USS Core patrolled in tight patterns, scanning the waves with radar and flares. When submarines attempted to surface, Wildcats dived on them immediately. Destroyer escorts attacked relentlessly with depth charges, sonar-guided attacks, and coordinated flanking maneuvers. Every U-boat that tried to strike found itself counterattacked before it could complete a single torpedo run. By the time the convoy reached safety, the outcome was clear. While the Allies lost a handful of merchant ships, the Germans had lost 6 U-boats destroyed outright and several more damaged beyond operational capacity. For the first time, the tactical initiative in the Atlantic had shifted decisively. Black May and the strategic repercussions, May 1943, soon to be remembered in German reports as Schwarzermai, marked the collapse of Germany's Atlantic strategy. The monthly U-boat losses reached 41, nearly 25% of the operational fleet. Donitz, who had once believed victory was inevitable, faced a stark reality. His submarines could no longer operate with impunity. The wolf pack, Germany's proud and feared weapon, had become increasingly vulnerable and costly. The psychological effect on German crews was immediate. Letters and logs reflected disbelief and shock. We were invincible, and suddenly we were hunted. Aircraft appeared where no aircraft could reach. Fear replaced confidence. Many U-boat commanders requested reassignment or early return to port. Dönitz himself reluctantly withdrew boats from the North Atlantic, ordering them to refocus on defensive patrols closer to home waters. The hunt, once theirs, had become a war of survival. The role of the escort carriers had proven their worth beyond expectation. They patrolled thousands of square miles of ocean, extending air cover to previously unreachable zones. Wildcats and Avengers detected periscopes, torpedo tracks, and even surface submarines at night or in storms. Their presence forced U-boats to remain submerged, drastically reducing speed, endurance, and operational effectiveness. Fuel shortages compounded the problem, particularly for boats relying on milch cow supply submarines, which were themselves prime targets for carrier aircraft. The integration of these small carriers with hunter-killer destroyer groups created a continuous, mobile shield around convoys. The mid-Atlantic gap, Germany's safe zone, had vanished. No longer could U-boats attack with impunity. The hunters had become the hunted, and the ocean had changed. German shock and strategic miscalculation. Dönitz had assumed that German submarines, well-trained and technologically capable, could adapt indefinitely. He did not fully appreciate the combination of Allied radar, HF/DF intelligence, and the mobility provided by escort carriers. Reports of aircraft suddenly appearing in previously unreachable zones baffled commanders. The loss of experienced crews and the rapid destruction of operational boats disrupted strategic planning. For the first time, Germany faced a problem it could not solve with skill or courage alone. In the aftermath of Black May, German U-boat production continued, but the strategic advantage had slipped permanently. Allied control of the Atlantic, enabled by escort carriers, was now a reality. Convoys began moving with confidence, and a lifeline to Britain was secure. The fear that had gripped merchant sailors for 3 long years began to fade, replaced by the cautious optimism of a new era. The turning tide, the collapse of the wolf packs, was more than a tactical victory. It was a psychological and strategic turning point. For the first time, Germany could no longer dictate the terms of the Atlantic battle. The Allies had gained initiative, innovation, and control. Escort carriers, once considered minor or experimental ships, had rewritten naval doctrine and forced the enemy into retreat. The Atlantic, once Germany's hunting ground, had become an Allied-controlled sea lane, and this shift would reverberate beyond the Atlantic. Secured supply lines enabled the buildup for the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and later Normandy. The U-boat threat, though not entirely eliminated, was diminished to a manageable level, allowing Allied planners to pursue global operations with renewed confidence. By the end of May 1943, one truth was undeniable. The Atlantic was no longer Germany's domain. The hunter had become the hunted, and the ocean itself had turned against them. The months following Black May 1943 marked a dramatic shift in the Battle of the Atlantic. The wolf packs, once a constant threat to Allied convoys, were now on the defensive. Germany had suffered catastrophic losses, 41 U-boats destroyed in May alone, with dozens more damaged or forced into early return to port. The operational fleet had been reduced by nearly a quarter, and the psychological impact on both crews and command was profound. Fear, previously reserved for Allied sailors, now settled over the German submarine arm. For the Allies, the result was transformative. Convoy loss rates, which had been alarmingly high, dropped sharply. Merchant ships, once vulnerable in the Black Pit, could now traverse the mid-Atlantic with relative safety. The introduction of escort carriers had fundamentally changed the calculus of the battle. Air cover, once impossible in the gap, was now constant. Aircraft patrolled in coordinated patterns, providing reconnaissance, immediate attack capability, and deterrence. The previously unstoppable wolf packs were now exposed and vulnerable. The industrial output of the United States played a critical role in consolidating this victory. Liberty ships continued to flow from the docks at an unprecedented pace, replacing lost tonnage faster than the Germans could sink it. Escort carriers were produced in numbers sufficient to cover multiple convoys simultaneously. Radar-equipped aircraft and destroyers were integrated into hunter-killer groups, creating a multi-layered defensive network that the U-boats could not penetrate. Even as Germany attempted to adapt with new tactics, altering routes, deploying new U-boat types, and introducing improved torpedoes, the Allies were always one step ahead. Intelligence breakthroughs, particularly the cracking of Enigma codes, allowed convoys to reroute around known Wolfpack positions, further reducing losses. By mid-1943, the Atlantic was no longer a war of attrition dictated solely by German submarines. It had become a controlled battlefield where Allied forces dictated engagements. The morale shift among Allied sailors was immediate. Merchant crews, who had endured months of anxiety and fear, now faced the ocean with renewed confidence. Destroyer captains relied on air patrols to extend their reach. Aircraft crews knew that every sighting and strike directly contributed to breaking the U-boat threat. For the first time in the campaign, the Atlantic was no longer a graveyard. It was a controlled, albeit still dangerous, theater of operations. This newfound stability had strategic consequences far beyond the Atlantic itself. Secured supply lines enabled the buildup of forces for operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Equipment, fuel, and troops could now be transported with far less risk of catastrophic loss. The war effort, particularly the European theater, began to accelerate. The lifeline to Britain, its food, weapons, and raw materials, was preserved. The German strategy to starve Britain into submission had failed. At the same time, Germany's confidence was shaken. U-boat crews reported higher casualties, dwindling operational numbers, and increasing encounters with air power they had considered impossible. Commanders faced an uncomfortable truth. The Atlantic campaign, which had once been their strongest strategic weapon, was now under Allied control. The transformation was complete. The Black Pit was no longer inviolable. Escort carriers, once experimental, had proven decisive. Radar, sonar, and coordinated hunter-killer tactics ensured the mid-Atlantic was no longer a sanctuary. Germany's hope of strangling Britain had been shattered, replaced by a persistent, growing Allied dominance that would endure for the rest of the war. And yet, while victory in the Atlantic was secured, the story was far from over. The Allies would continue to refine tactics, expand air coverage, and pursue the U-boats across oceans. The war had changed, and the ocean, once Germany's greatest advantage, had become a symbol of Allied ingenuity and resolve. By the summer of 1943, the implications of Allied control over the Atlantic were becoming clear. The German U-boat arm, once the centerpiece of Hitler's naval strategy, had been forced into retreat. Dönitz, who had spent years building a fleet he believed invincible, now faced an operational crisis. Submarines were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Experienced crews, the backbone of the Kriegsmarine, were lost at alarming rates, creating a gap between command expectations and reality. The Wolfpack doctrine, the very tactic that had dominated the ocean for years, was effectively broken. German reports from May 1943 onward reflect both disbelief and urgency. Commanders wrote of aircraft appearing in the middle of the Atlantic where no aircraft should exist, of coordinated attacks from escort carriers and destroyers, and of convoys reaching their destinations largely intact. The tactical advantage that had once belonged to the U-boats had evaporated almost overnight. Germany's submarine fleet would never regain the dominance it had once enjoyed. For the Allies, the consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Secured convoys meant the continuous flow of men, equipment, and supplies from North America to Britain. This enabled major operations in North Africa, leading to the defeat of Axis forces in Tunisia. It laid the groundwork for the Sicilian campaign, the Italian mainland operations, and ultimately the preparation for Operation Overlord in 1944. Without control of the Atlantic, None of these campaigns could have been supplied or reinforced reliably. The industrial superiority of the United States, combined with technological innovation and strategic foresight, had created a decisive advantage. Escort carriers, small but versatile, had fundamentally altered the dynamics of naval warfare. They extended air cover into previously unreachable areas, forced U-boats to operate defensively, and allowed destroyer groups to hunt submarines systematically. The synergy of air, sea, and intelligence operations transformed the Atlantic from a contested space into an Allied-controlled corridor. The psychological impact on German forces was profound. Morale among U-boat crews plummeted. Letters and diaries describe shock and disbelief at the loss of what had been considered invulnerable operational freedom. The withdrawal of submarines from the North Atlantic marked a significant strategic defeat. Dönitz himself acknowledged in internal communications that the tonnage war, Germany's key strategy to starve Britain, was failing. Meanwhile, Allied confidence soared. Convoy commanders could now plan with greater certainty, knowing that escort carriers and their air patrols would provide continuous protection. Merchant crews, long accustomed to dread and uncertainty, could focus on maintaining schedules and supporting the war effort. The Atlantic, once a theater of constant peril, had been transformed into a controlled lifeline, a vital artery sustaining the Allied war machine. The long-term effects were undeniable. Germany's inability to regain Atlantic dominance allowed the Allies to shift focus toward offensive operations across multiple theaters. Supplies flowed freely to North Africa and Europe, enabling sustained campaigns and ultimately the liberation of occupied territories. The strategic, technological, and industrial lessons learned in the Atlantic would influence naval planning for the remainder of the war, solidifying the principle that control of sea lanes, supported by combined arms and intelligence, was decisive in modern conflict. By the end of 1943, the Atlantic was no longer a battlefield dominated by fear of the U-boat. It had become a demonstration of Allied ingenuity, coordination, and industrial power, a turning point that would echo across every theater of the Second World War. Germany's hope of cutting Britain from its lifelines had ended. The ocean, once a domain of terror, was now firmly under Allied control, ensuring that the war could be supplied, fought, and ultimately won.